Your glucose levels can impact.
Put on fat, for example, you can eat meat, fish, eggs. Insulin has not been now.
In the functional health world, we know excess weight isn't just about calories in versus out. It's a symphony of hidden culprits, hormonal havoc from stress and sleep sabotage, gut imbalances throwing off your hunger signals, toxin overloads disrupting metabolism, and even emotional wiring from past traumas. But here's the truth. Carrying extra pounds isn't harmless baggage. It ramps up your risk for everything from type 2 diabetes to heart disease to joint pain, brain fog, and even certain cancers. Join us as we explore root cause strategies to shed weight sustainably, reclaim your energy, and rewrite your health narrative. I know that this opening statement might come across as very fat-phobic, and I'm sure a lot of people listening to this would feel this, sure, I fall within that category. Do you think being overweight is simply a self-control issue?
So the straightforward medical answer is no. There is a but let's first just look at the chemistry of obesity and overweight. So if you think of the whole root cause of the challenge, it still goes back to inflammation. Chronic inflammation and then acute on chronic episodes. So my equation for anti-aging and longevity is literally for you to anti-age, you have to manage your anti-inflammatory lifestyle modifications, and it's got to be coupled and amplified with calorie restriction. So that's if you pull in Professor David Sinclair from Harvard Medical School, if you bring in any patient into the equation and the calorie control is not in a restricted fashion and the inflammation markers are uncontrolled, they're not going to reach their full health span and lifespan. That's a fact. So from a scientific point of view, if you drive down inflammation, in other words, your body mass and the amount of healthy or unhealthy fat cells you have versus calorie restriction, it's impossible to get to a full lifespan.
I know that you are very passionate about people who are overweight, and I know that you are passionate about helping them lose, let's say, fat cells. Let's call it what it is. We don't want to lose muscle. Why is it so important to you?
So I exchanged my stethoscope in 2003 when one of my special needs patients came in. It was a young little boy, 6 years old, and he was playing around with my stethoscope, and he took his finger and he drove it straight through the film of the stethoscope, and the stethoscope was busted. And the only thing I had to actually examine him was my scale. And I had an in-body scale at that stage, one of the very first in-body scales. And I actually put him on there, and there were so much more metrics than I could read and deduct from that interpretation of his body composition than just listening to his heartbeat and his respiration and counting his heart rate. So at that stage, that was a real tipping point in my career, and I decided to trade in my stethoscope for a scale and just really focus in and hone in on what lies beneath the surface, not just this silly BMI table that dates back to the 1800s, but what really lies beneath the surface when a patient is out of shape. So when I look at a patient, I don't see a patient that's fat or skinny. I don't do overweight or obese or BMI or anything. I simply look at a patient and I see that they're out of shape or inflamed, or I see that they're more in shape or less inflamed or deflamed. So, and then I start looking at parameters to drive down inflammatory markers and inflammation and the resulting water retention that happens there. And that's how you drive down the inflammation and get them to a proper health span that meets up with a lifespan.
More than 50% of South Africans fall within the obese or overweight category. Can health and that coexist?
No, it can't. Impossible. Because the more adipocytes you carry with you, so that means the more fat cells you carry with you, the more inflammatory cytokines you carry in those fat cells. And you can have a healthy and an unhealthy fat cell, but the more fat cells you have, it means the more unhealthy they are. So you've got this huge mass of adipocyte clusters, so fat cell clusters, that carry over 350 inflammatory markers and molecules. So the more of them there are, the more are being released into your system, which we measure as inflammatory markers on blood. So it's virtually impossible.
I know that overeating is not necessarily just a plus B equation for many people. I know that it's very emotional. How do we help those patients? Where do we start with an emotional eater?
So you have to still get to the root. What was that little trigger that caused them to associate that emotion with the overeating and the type of foods that they tend to overindulge in? So I have one patient, the beautiful girl that I met in 2007, and when her father passed away, her aunt, her brother's sister, came to her at the funeral and stuffed a slab chocolate into her hand. And the message, the silent, unwritten message she got from that was, whenever you have this type of pain and a loss of life or a loss of something significant, you go and you stuff your face. And she literally finished the slab, and that resulted in going into a morbidly obese category. And eventually she came for behavior modification, not to lose the weight. She came for me to actually delve down so that we got to the root of that emotional trigger for her. And for her, it was always protecting herself, and whenever she feels pain and hurt and emotional discharge, that she needed to consume calories. And specifically, her default memory was a slab of chocolate.
Physiologically, what happens? Because we know that many things can actually be explained physiologically. Why would a person be more hungry when they're going through a more distressing time?
So the minute it happens, your fight and flight mechanism obviously switches on, and you generally, in a ratio-dependent way, are depleted from serotonin. So in your occipital lobe, predominantly, your serotonin level drops, and the quickest way your body can grab hold of any tools and raw materials to start manufacturing and producing serotonin again is carbohydrates. So the quickest route for your body to upregulate your serotonin is a sugar fix.
In a country like South Africa, where there's a lot of stresses, we are stressed for our safety, financially. Do you think many South Africans, because it correlates quite, well, it's interesting that there's such a large obesity rate, but also such high stress levels just in our day-to-day life. Do you think they are connected?
So yes, they are, but on multiple levels. So if you just look at the vitamin D conundrum, one of our favorite topics, so most of our population is hypovitaminosis D, so it means that they are fairly gravely underactive on metabolism because of low vitamin D levels. I know there's a lot of people that will disagree with me that vitamin D alone can drive up and regulate the metabolism, but if a functional doctor looks at thyroid function, and you've got a thyroid patient or any autoimmune thyroid patient, we know intuitively that once the vitamin D level rises above 60 nanograms, your thyroid receptor complex only activates and switches on. Now, your thyroid medication can fit properly onto the receptor site and drive metabolism and do what it's functionally and physiologically supposed to do. So, low vitamin D levels, absolutely. The minute you look at your neurotransmitter profile, the minute you look at your low lithium levels, just in our average standard drinking water, and I'm not advocating we go and drink more tap water or any water source available, but South Africa is notorious for having the lowest levels of lithium salt complexes in our drinking water, and that also takes care of a very specific mood stabilizing and stress reducing effect in our bodies.
Where do you connect inflammation with obesity and health? How does that triangle look?
So if we healthily age or anti-age, we have to be in a state of deflamed inflammation, and we've got to be mindful of calories, because we know calories are the one thing that drives and utilizes a lot of nutrients and vitamins and minerals, that activates metabolism. And the minute the cells start with metabolism, it starts turning over cell production and cell death, and then new cells come up. So the minute your calories rise, the more it incinerates and tweaks the metabolism to start turning over cells, which leads to a shorter lifespan. So from a medical point of view, the minute you look at lifestyle and health and behaviors and how we use our bodies to go through an exercise routine and just healthy habits, how we approach food from an emotional point of view or just from a habitual point of view, that's why I always recommend you never go and do grocery shopping on an empty stomach, because that's when you just do like most people do. They take a trolley and not just an appropriate basket, and they go through the whole aisle, all the aisles, that don't skip an aisle, and they land up buying way more than they're supposed to make. So from a medical point of view, there's a huge correlation between direct calorie consumption, inflammation levels systemically in the body, and directly correlated with body mass.
What do you see is some of the biggest metabolic blockers when it comes to patients who does everything right in those terms? You know, they exercise a little bit, they eat moderate. What do you see as some of the other challenges?
So the first thing, people have fallen into this very bad habit where we don't celebrate food anymore the way our ancestors used to, and they don't celebrate with a siesta, that little rest after a lunch or whatever before they open up business again. So I think from a normal living life, we generally dehydrate chronically. We generally eat too fast and chew too little and swallow too early. So digestion, we know, happens in the mouth and with the chew response. So if you eat like a typical boarding student, from a preservation point of view, you had to literally swallow and then re-chew later on. So just to make sure that you had enough slices of bread to sustain you in the day. So that same principles, we don't take the time to sit down and eat. We eat very inappropriately. We eat high calorie foods, which is nutrient sparse and nutrients deficient, but it's very dense in sugars, and you reach a satiety very quickly, but there's no fiber, there's no protein to sustain a proper adequate blood level response. If you just look at the way that glucose and insulin communicate to each other, I think it's already disrupted by just the way and the speed at which we consume food today.
Fluctuations in energy levels, post-meal crashes, or stress-induced highs often stem from imbalances in insulin and cortisol. In functional medicine, these hormones signal underlying issues such as gastrointestinal dysfunction or sleep disruption. What's the job of insulin in the body?
Insulin is a hormone, obviously. It's a hormone that closely relates to your blood glucose levels. And the most important thing for insulin is to make sure that your brain doesn't have an overdrive of glucose, because it's very toxic for the brain. So the minute it picks up a glucose spike in the brain, it's excreted to actually just measure it down to a usable level so that it doesn't become toxic to the brain per se. And then obviously to also adequately convert the glucose into energy for usable energy sources.
Do you see cortisol playing a role when it comes to food behaviors, eating, and also just weight loss in general?
So cortisol is unfortunately one of our big generals of our fight and flight response. So it's a hormone, but I think it's been so dysregulated and so often called upon that it's almost like that crying wolf. So from a medical point of view, the same thing happens with cortisol. So you get these cortisol spikes in surges. You've got insulin as a desensitized hormone, but a copycat of the general. So whenever cortisol spikes, you've got this insulin short spikes and bursts following cortisol spikes. And whenever you need to run away, this is now a very core function, but if you ever run away from danger, your body needs to conserve energy to keep running. Otherwise, the wolf is going to get you. So from a medical point of view, if you in these frequent cortisol surges and spikes with frequent insulin spikes following it, and you're not really getting into a stage where your insulin and glucose respond to each other, you get frequent glucose drops, you get hypoglycemic events, you're hungry within 45 minutes after a normal meal, and your insulin and glucose almost like disconnect and miscommunicates. And that's when you start developing this whole insulin resistance-like state in the body. So in a non-stress environment, cortisol has the exact opposite effect on insulin. So the minute you have just a normal surge of cortisol, it suppresses the release of insulin in the pancreas, and you've got this nice general slow release of glucose in the body. So that's what happened in a non-stress state. But the minute you're in this chronic state of cortisol spikes, and cortisol chronically suppresses the insulin, then all of a sudden it starts getting into that desensitized state, almost like that crying wolf. Because then you've got pseudo-cortisol, but actually real cortisol. You don't get glucose going up, you get insulin starting to rise, and then you get a behavioral component coming in as well, because now when you stress, you eat. So now you've got these high glucose spikes to sustain the stressful period. You've got this disproportionate suppressing of cortisol as it was supposed to be from an anatomical design point of view, and now all of a sudden you start developing insulin resistance because none of them communicate anymore. So they don't perform the physiological functions as it was supposed to. And that's why we develop insulin resistance.
So you are telling me that our lifestyle in the cities really directly contribute towards us being in such a conundrum in South Africa?
So the environment unfortunately plays a huge role. So if we just measure our amounts of insulin resistance in our patient population coming from CBDs and from city centers versus patients coming from coastal regions, we see insulin resistance is not as bad in the coastal regions, and the inflammation patterns and inflammation markers, so literally the concentration of the inflammation markers, are slightly less at coastal regions because of the environment.
The modern urban South African diet, shaped by Western influences, features an influx of processed sugars, refined carbohydrates, and fast foods. While convenient, this pattern disrupts the gut microbiome, elevates inflammatory markers, and promotes fat accumulation. The encouraging aspect, recognizing this shift, empowers you to adopt nutrient-dense alternatives, restoring metabolic balance and enhancing overall well-being. When we look at the whole population of South Africa, I'm not just talking about the middle class. What do you think leads across the different income groups to obesity and being overweight?
That's a good question. I think it's our standard African diet, so our SAD diet as we know it in South Africa, unfortunately has this predisposition of going for more refined carbs because it fills us up quicker and it's a bit cheaper. So a loaf of bread is definitely more affordable than a loaf of sourdough bread or a banting bread or something that just takes a little bit more time to tweak the production of it. So I think it's a habitual thing where we see the conundrum of urbanization and the people from rural and previously disadvantaged communities having more access and job opportunities in the city. So with urbanization, they're starting to adopt the quick, instant style of living that they see people that are already urbanized and follow the patterns of those. So I think our standard African diet has become a very, very Western diet lifestyle. It's very quick. It's high calories. It's high calories in quick succession. Business meetings are happening around food venues and coffee shops and restaurants. And I just think people generally make bad choices when it comes to a quick hour lunch or a quick coffee meeting or whatever, and they make poorer decisions on the spot. Whereas if you go back to a traditional rural village in a setting, you do find that the obesity rates there are also starting to increase, but you'll find it's people having job creation in the city and job offers in the city that go and slowly take back some bad habits and higher GI foods back to the rural areas.
Doc, I heard a while back someone paraphrasing being obese as being malnourished. And the concept sort of was that due to the fact that some people eat nutrient-poor foods and higher refined carbs, causes them to become nutrient deficient, and their bodies actually being hungry to eat more and more until the nutrient levels are restored. Do you think there's any truth in that?
That's very true. So, I mean, if you go up into the SADC countries and you go to the equator and you go just north of the equator where we know that famine and food deprivation is a reality for a lot of people, unfortunately, we do find that tendency, especially with the body morphology, where you start to actually go through a process, a very unnatural process of sarcopenia, where you start breaking down muscle mass, not just because of aging, but because of malnourishment and malnutrition. So the proteins are being taken from skeletal muscle mass, converted into fat cells, and then you get these calorie space foods that are just being consumed until they get to a satiety level, instead of the education model that needs to be getting in nutrient-dense, calorie-dense foods into a specific ratio to reach satiety, but to get all the right macros and micronutrients in there.
Hunger pangs and mindless snacking often trace back to hormonal signals gone awry, but satiety hormones serve as the body's natural brakes on overeating. In functional medicine, imbalances from chronic stress, poor sleep, or gut dysbiosis can blunt these signals, fueling weight gain and insulin resistance. What hormones drive satiety?
So if you look at hormones specifically, so the first one, in my opinion, that is the most underrated, unfortunately, is our pancreas hormone self, so insulin. So insulin is the first hormone that really is supposed physiologically to register satiety. But if you look at your hormones coming from the brain and the brain-gut axis, you get your ghrelin hormone that almost sounds like a gremlin that is always very hungry. So that is the hormone that signals from the stomach to the brain that your body goes through hunger spells, and then you get leptin coming down from the brain and central nervous system with a very specific pathway, supposed to be registering satiety in the stomach. So the minute your stomach receptors go through a certain portion and percentage of distension, the hormones are supposed to be in unison and communication, but I mean, we in a state where if you just drink a lot of carbonated beverages, high sugar beverages, you get to the state of a sugar high and a stomach distension. Your body is supposed to be registering a satiety level, but there's no nutrients to sustain on fuel-wise, because once the sugar beverages work out, you've got this hypoglycemic events, and all of a sudden your ghrelin just starts to release again. And then eventually you get to the same conundrum as before with cortisol and insulin, where you become leptin resistant because of this mixed message and signaling that you give the brain and the body 24/7 by just consuming all these calorie space and nutrient space type of sugary beverages.
I've never heard of leptin resistance. This is so interesting because I can imagine in a country where a lot of people are also very scared that they're not going to have a next meal. Bringing it back to poverty, that so many people, I can imagine if there's the opportunity to eat, that you sort of have to eat, and that's sort of starting a cycle. Can you ever heal from something like leptin resistance?
So leptin resistance is almost like a game of chess that you play, and you've got to be very strategic on it. So from a medical point of view, yes, leptin resistance can be managed in the same way as insulin resistance can be managed. All depends on the patient's threshold. So everybody's got a individual difference and different set of fingerprints and different set of genetics. So once you go past a certain threshold, then that leptin resistance becomes a real conundrum to actually get. But then now we're going into neuropeptides and very specific hormone cascade that gets involved. But if it's a patient that buys in from a lifestyle perspective, and they at least follow a 30-day metabolic reset program, you can actually get them to be a lot more leptin appropriate, not necessarily healing the leptin resistance that they've been in a bad habit of forming themselves.
Many people put in the effort, follow the plan, and make the right choices, yet still struggle to lose weight. It can feel frustrating, discouraging, and deeply personal. But this challenge is more common than you might think. And it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. In this segment, we'll explore why progress can stall, what factors often go unseen, and how you can move forward with confidence. Stay with us as we break down the barriers and remind you that your journey is worth pushing, no matter how many times you've had to start again. We see a lot of patients that, let's say they are eating quite well, they are active, they're not excessively exercising, but they live a decently active lifestyle, but they're not losing weight. What else do you look at in your practice to make sure that it's maybe not something else that's hidden?
So when I see a patient, especially if it's a new patient, just to explain a typical patient journey. So, I mean, he or she would walk in and I would do just my basic medical symptoms questionnaire. And then we need to obviously know what's happening from a metabolic and a biochemical point of view. So there we need to do fasting bloods. We need to measure baseline vitamin D just to determine the metabolism. We need to do in-body just to see exactly what the metrics are and the ratios are. We need to understand the patient's inflammation profile. We need to understand if she's got hormone imbalances such as insulin resistance. Maybe she's got a estrogen dominant hormone profile and we just need to balance out with a little bit of progesterone. Maybe she's androgen dominant, so that means male hormones in a female body that's just slightly out of ratio, and we just need to manage them down and get her metabolism back to where she was. And then obviously the World Health Organization says we recommend moderate to low intensity exercise, 30 minutes most days of the week. So at least 4 days a week of 30 minutes doing something more than what you're doing currently.
Doc, I always feel so bad for patients. Myself, I lost 30 kilograms last year from December, and obviously it took a lot, and we'll dig into some of that later. But I imagine patients having to lose 50, 60, 70 kgs when they are hyper compliant and they do everything that they need to do for, let's say, a whole month, and they lose 4 kilograms. In our practice, I mean, that's good results. 1 kilogram a week, that's brilliant. But on that person, they won't even see the difference in the mirror. They won't see the difference. I mean, 4 kilograms on the scale can be so disheartening. And I've seen it time and time again in your practice where a patient would come in, start on a journey, be so excited, and after a month, they'll come back and say, oh, I only lost 6 kilograms or 8 kilograms, and then they sort of give up. To me, that breaks my heart because I'm cheering for them. Why do you think... What would your advice be to a patient who's got such a large amount to go?
So they're obviously in a condition that we refer to as a immunometabolic compromise. So the immune system is totally dysregulated, constant chronic low-grade inflammation, and the big culprit there is usually uric acid. So that's why we need to be on the number with that uric acid level. So if I see someone who's got that stubborn weight loss pattern, I really just zoom in on driving down the uric acid levels to a significantly all-time low, and all of a sudden you break that stubborn plateau, because then that whole immune dysregulation and the whole metabolic profile just changes. A patient also needs to understand that a kilojoule coming from a protein and a kilojoule coming from a carbohydrate and a kilojoule coming from sugar behaves very differently in the body. So some of them are really, and I don't debunk any diet or diet plan or meal plan. I actually love any diet as long as you stick to it. You're going to be losing weight, you're going to be staying focused because you do meal preps, you actually follow your nutritionist, your dietitian's prescription. And why I like it is because they really just cut out all the nonsense, all the high kilojoule, calorie rich foods, and they start to really put in a lot more fiber, better protein ratio, a little bit of a technical approach there, but the functional nutritionists and the dietitians, they are brilliant at compiling that program for you. So once you get to a stage where you hit the plateau, they obviously carry a lot of inflammation, so I'll always keep on driving down the inflammatory markers and manage inflammation down. Keep an eye on the uric acid levels, and then just keep the patient focused and keep them coming back to weigh, to measure, to pep talk, just to change up a little bit. Maybe do a day of fasting, a water fast, go for a colon cleanse, or just a nice metabolic shift for the body, just to release that stubborn weight. we don't treat the symptoms, we treat the cause of it. The cause of the overweight or obesity-like state is dysregulated inflammation, uncontrolled inflammation. So we get them to focus on the inflammation markers, we get them to rather focus on centimeters, and we try to put it into a very practical space for them where they know that a 500 gram cube of butter or salted butter or margarine, human fat and butter's got the same density more or less. So you try to get them to focus on how many cubes of margarine or butter they've lost in total, to get them to focus on the volume versus the space and the centimeters instead of just getting stuck on the kilograms and getting despondent.
Where do you start if a person, let's say a person realizes that, listen, I don't want to live in this prison of my own body. It's not out of hatred towards my own body, but I can't move as I want to. I can't pick up my children. I can't play with them. I'm tired all the time. I can't walk far before I'm really out of breath. When a person says, enough is enough, I don't want to live like this anymore, how do they turn this whole ship around?
Well, the first thing is the decision to actually turn the ship around. And if there's at least the awareness that they're not comfortable with the body that they're currently living in, the symptoms they're currently experiencing. So if they join up with, and I mean, the internet's also filled with information on how to start an approach, how to connect with a functional doctor, functional medical practitioner, and really just to start with changing your mindset on how you approach exercise, your sleep hygiene, your food specifically, and you just start changing one modality at a time. Not to have this whole 180-degree turn and then try to get to a different result, but starting at very, very planned, small little different choices, new habits, new ideas, opening yourself up to change, feeling the change, and then improving on that week in and week out.
So if a mom heard the podcast, must she go home and just change everything? Chuck the sweets, chuck the cool drink, no takeaways, and we're only eating vegetables. So what would be an actionable plan for a person to change their home and home environment?
Well, I think it depends on the mom's personality. Some moms are just like that, where they say, listen, it's a new broom and it's a clean sweep and we start afresh. But I do think if you just start at least with a small, seizable, manageable first step, and you just start to inform your family. And I mean, the listeners are a diverse population of patients themselves, moms, young parents, parents planning to be parents, and also the elderly. I mean, they know if they hear about inflammation and maybe they've never managed inflammation, let's go and get our medical metrics measured and let's start writing them down. Let's go to knowledgeable doctors who have passion and who have compassion about conditions like this, and to really start driving together as a team, being empowered and enabled to interpret the results and to look at stubborn weight loss patterns and to look at interesting tweaks and changes in recipes and approaches, how to actually get the results, and then enforcing that onto the next generation.
For years, BMI has been used as a quick way to classify weight and health. But the truth is, it tells very little about what's actually happening inside the body. It can't distinguish between muscle and fat. It can't show where the fat is stored, and it often overlooks key markers for real health. I know the in-body scale is a much better metric than the BMI or the total weight, because we know that muscle does weigh a lot more than fat. So what can an in-body scale measure, firstly? And secondly, what do you want to see improvements on?
Yeah, so in-body is just more with it. It's visual. Your patient engages well with those printouts and those reports. And what you actually see there is the total amount of body water that they carry, which is a huge culprit when it comes to excess weight, and just making the difference between, are you still in the higher category of the old school BMI, or are you actually losing the inflammatory water pools as well? It measures your total skeletal muscle mass, and it measures it in specific segments. So for instance, your upper extremities, lower extremities, it measures the skeletal muscle mass. measures the visceral fat specifically as a percentage and a kilogram of your total body mass. So it's just a lot more informative and a lot more fun to work with those different type of components and just getting your focus off the kilograms and the BMI to see if you're in a lesser category and just focusing in seeing if are you managing the inflammation correctly? Are your patients really buying into getting back into a healthy lifestyle, getting the skeletal muscle mass up a little bit, getting the basal metabolic rate to increase as they put on a little bit more muscle, so not just to be hyper-focused on kilogram per se.
I'm always so interested because you look at the BMI metric and as you mentioned, it's so outdated. And
so remember, it's 1832. It's a Belgian scientist or mathematician. The guy was 50 kilograms probably, a scrawny little scringy guy. And now he tries to put it on the African continent with African bones, real Burki muscles, African muscle. It's impossible to put a standard African guy into a BMI table. You're actually doing that patient a huge injustice.
And something I also wondered about, because the BMI scale, I mean, if you take a bodybuilder, it will say that this person is obese.
Morbidly obese.
And even if that person goes to do the medical aid health check, they will be labeled as obese when they are definitely much healthier than the typical person that has that same amount in fat. Do you think they should actually make space at medical aid offices, etc., for the in-body scale or alike? I mean, we are talking about a brand name here now, but anything of the like?
Yeah, I think if you look at different metrics of measurement, I actually think it's functional doctors and practices like ours that need to come together to work out what South Africa's or Africa's BMI table should look like.
GLP-1 medications such as Ozempic or Wegovy have become a powerful tool for weight management, but there's an important part of the conversation that often gets overlooked: their impact on muscle mass. And muscle is essential for strength, metabolism, and long-term health. What is your opinion on muscle mass? I know in the 90s, women were really scared to gain muscle. As long as the scale was a certain amount, then they felt good. They knew this was my number and they just sort of worked towards that. And even in the 90s, a lot of women would eat less and less and less, and their bodies, the metabolism, everything would just slow down. And over time, they would, as you mentioned earlier, what would happen is the body would eat the muscle mass and that would go down. So the scale looks good, but they're actually going backwards health-wise. What's the reason why we should have muscle? And would you say that it's important for us to build more muscle mass as we age?
So from an inflammation point of view, the more muscle, the less adipocytes or fat cells you have, the less inflamed you are. So generally, the more muscles you have, the higher your basal metabolic rate is, the faster your metabolism is. In other words, the quicker you burn energy and glucose, and you convert glucose into usable energy for your cells in the body. So generally, the ratio between muscle and fat is a very interesting ratio to get the patients to focus on. In our view, more muscle is obviously more youthful. It looks fuller, it looks plumper, it looks more attractive, it looks younger. So there you get closer to the longevity picture, instead of seeing what we refer to now these days, and we'll touch a little bit on the newer weight loss remedies, but the GLP-1 receptor analogs, and what you see with these classic Ozempic faces and all the rest, where they really have a rapid weight loss, a rapid muscle and skeletal muscle mass loss, and they're looking like these gaunt little zombies walking around, and we have to go and stuff their faces full of fillers and Botox.
Doc, but now that we're on the topic, I'm very interested. What's your opinion on the GLP-1s?
Look, I think from a medical perspective, I believe it's one of the medical miracles. In the last 25 years of me practicing medicine and functional medicine specifically, it's been one of the biggest discoveries scientifically that I found that really changes your cardiovascular risk disease profile. that changes your inflammation profile systemically, that drives down weight loss independently, so it lowers your risk for obesity and cardiovascular disease, and it actually has a very positive effect on even concomitant diseases that you find in chronic diseases of lifestyle, like osteoarthritis, the type of joint health, the way that the inflammation changes in the joint space, because we know osteoarthritis is a metabolic disease. So the better your cardiometabolic state is and the less inflammation you produce in that system, the better your joints are also evolving.
So I know there are different ones available, the tirzepatides, semaglutides. What are they?
It's very scientific. I don't want to bore the people out there, but I mean, the abbreviation is a GLP-1 receptor analog or secretagogue. So it's a glucagon-like peptide. So it's an amino acid sequence, a peptide fragment that mimics the body's way that the gut actually releases glucagon, and that alters your insulin and your hunger state and your satiety state. So it releases a little bit more insulin, and you burn glucose and you burn fat cells, and your satiety level kicks in at a more physiological rate. So it's a brilliant discovery, in my opinion. I'm a huge fan of it if it's used wisely and under medical supervision. Obviously now with all the online marketing and advertising happening, so it's unfortunately very dysregulated. It's very accessible. So unfortunately, there's a lot of people misusing and abusing it. And I think it should be done in a medical setting with a medical practitioner in overview, with a functional approach, and with a lifestyle modification. If you don't buy into it for the long term, I can guarantee you those people will bounce back. They're going to increase and double their weights. They're going to be in a much poorer state because they're not going to have the muscle mass and the bone density to carry them into their new season.
I'm interested, does the medication cause the muscle decay, or is it the fact that people get malnourished if they don't eat enough?
Well, a combination of both, but the medication per se doesn't alone break down muscle mass. So it literally is only a mimic of the GLP-1 receptor complex. So all that happens is you burn a lot of your adipocyte content, your excess storage fat, the triglycerides, and you have this beautiful synergy of insulin. So insulin resistance patients do extremely well managing their weight because of the mimic effect of the GLP-1 injections.
Do you think there's a correlation also between the overuse of the semaglutides and tirzepatides versus eating disorders?
I'd say we're definitely already witnessing it. We're definitely heading into that space. And if a patient is literally doing it as a short-term effect under medical supervision to drop the cardiovascular disease risk because of the type of weight category that they fall in, manage down the inflammation adequately and medically, and they keep on measuring it, and they buy into the long-term effect, it's going to be a 2 to 3 month period that they'll be on the assistance of injectables, and then they will kick over into a long-term lifestyle program.
That's quite interesting. I see online a lot of people are saying once you start it, you never can stop. Do you think there's any truth in that?
Well, I think because it gives such a prolific weight loss result in the beginning, the patients literally don't have the time to adapt and make the lifestyle changes mentally. So they can't even in a short-term space see themselves changing their behaviors, and that's why I think we're heading into that conundrum you're referring to.
So there's a very large group of people on the internet that's using the different semaglutides or tirzepatides, who's PCOS patients who actually end up falling pregnant. Can you explain why do you think that happens?
So that's why I say it's really a miracle drug in the right hands, in the right setting with a multidisciplinary team. If you look at the way that polycystic ovarian syndrome is classified, you've got the triad of being a difficult weight bearer, so you either have difficult weight loss patterns or you put on weight easily. You've got this insulin resistance, and then occasionally you've got this hormonal change where you find that you actually have cysts on the ovaries. Those patients are technically progesterone deficient, in my opinion. So a functional medical practitioner views it as a state of progesterone deficiency, and where you just need to get that estrogen and androgen and progesterone ratio functional again and get them communicating in a very specific ratio, and then it addresses the insulin resistance as well. So the minute the insulin resistance is addressed, your insulin actually secretes physiologically, your satiety is reached physiologically, you drive down all the excess fat cells with all the inflammation markers. Now you're in a state of optimal physiology. And what happens if you do what needs to be done from a fertility point of view, you will get the result. So those patients are just being embedded into an environment where they're physiologically prepared to really fall pregnant naturally. But I do think if you work with a functional doctor and they address you holistically and not just focus on one solution and one spoke in the wheel, you're actually going to get past your infertility challenges a lot quicker.
I know that the specific suggestion is that you need to have a washout period after stopping this medication for 2 months before trying to conceive. Do you think if you get to your goal and you stop the medication to try to conceive, do you think that is still applicable? Because I know a lot of women online on Facebook groups and interesting forums where they advise each other to stay on this medication while actively trying to conceive. And I mean, there's not a lot of data out there yet in this window period of 2 months.
I think if you miss your standard medical checkups and your standard checkups with your gynae and you veer away from the plan and the protocol that's set out for you to actually conceive physiologically or with assistance, I mean, if you can't naturally, then I think my first medical answer will be if you fell pregnant while being on it, the minute you discover that you're pregnant, you should discontinue. And then afterwards, hopefully that recalibration and the long-term strategy kicks in. But they're following up with your gynecologist, your functional doctor, a dietitian, a nutritionist. I think that's the long-term solution. But if your body managed to get into a state where physiologically you fell pregnant, then I think you just discontinue the day you find out that you've conceived.
I think it's also very interesting, if a woman loses a lot of weight and immediately falls pregnant, I don't think there's been a long time where there was maintenance involved. And I think getting off of a medication, entering a first trimester where I think hormones are all over the place, hunger shoots through the roof, that can become so difficult to manage your weight effectively throughout pregnancy. So it makes sense to stop a while before you're trying to conceive.
I'm sure there will be a few research studies and clinical trials out in the near future as we both evolve and patient and doctors evolve in this whole new modality that we've been given with the GLP-1 analogs.
So you mentioned that some of your autoimmune patients do much better on the GLP-1s. Where do you bring the whole approach of food versus autoimmune diseases and also something like a GLP-1, where do you connect that?
Inflammation.
Okay.
So remember the definition of autoimmune disease is a progressive condition of chronic inflammation, and then you get to the specific organ system that's affected, albeit asthma, eczema, psoriasis, lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, metabolic, type 1 diabetes, Hashimoto's when it comes to thyroid. So it's always a chronic condition characterized by chronic low-grade inflammation in a specific subset in an organ system. So the minute you start dropping your inflammation markers and the minute you start getting your inflammation markers that are connected with your adipocytes and your fat cells into a better ratio and space, physiologically, your body just does better. The minute you connect food that drives inflammation, the minute you get food that aggravates inflammation, that causes gut dysregulation, gut dysbiosis, then you get to a state where autoimmune diseases are really poorly managed, because a lot of physicians, and especially specialists, they don't really regard food as a big challenge for patients and a big area of education for patients, where we as a functional practice have a lot better compliant patients when it comes to meal preps and foods that drive down inflammation with better long-term control on their chronic condition.
Food is often talked about only in terms of calories, diets, and restrictions, but its role in our lives goes far beyond numbers. What we eat is tied to our families, our traditions, our memories, and the culture we come from. That's why weight loss isn't just a nutritional journey, it's an emotional and cultural one too. When we acknowledge the deeper role food plays, we can approach change with respect, awareness, and a much greater chance of long-term success. I think it's a very difficult space to be in if you are already quite overweight, and I think it's sort of like you are already in the system. Many people grew up in a household where healthy food and vegetables are not even part of the diet. I know of so many people where you'll walk into the house and the only vegetables they've got is potatoes that goes into a curry or goes into a mash. So what conversations do you think needs to happen around food in households?
Well, I think the first change that needs to take place is we need to hit the reset button, and we need to stop the old school thinking where food was either a punishment or a reward system. So I think we need to get that old school thinking out and just start thinking afresh to say, listen, food is a basic part of life. We do need it. We do need to celebrate more around it and get the family more involved around it and get all those generational recipes coming back into our kitchen again, getting the family to participate in preparing the food. And I do think it's also a good point of departure for patients, especially who's had a very guilty conscience and a guilty mindset about food in their past, to stop the blame game and to actually forgive themselves and to just turn a new clean page and a clean slate and start afresh, make good, wise decisions day in and day out, involve the family and inform them why the new, wiser decision will lead to a better outcome.
There's a very interesting story of a school in South Africa, one of the really high-performing schools, that made some changes. I think it was about 15 years ago. They started making exceptionally strict rules when it came to the lunch boxes. The school just said, from this point forward, we'll inspect the lunch boxes every day. I know that they were not allowed to have white bread. They were not allowed to have any sweets, any chips, any cool drinks. In the lunch boxes, it had to be fruits, vegetable sticks, biltong druiwors, different types of healthy foods. And it was really just enforced. It was just the way it was. And what they started to see was that a lot of these kids actually went home and they started preferring healthier foods at home as well, because this was what was normal. And that gives us such a big clue as to what power small changes can have. What would you think would be another good change that can be made all around, just in society as a whole?
Well, that's typically the story where you have that generational mindset, where you're actually thinking of the generation to come. So I think it's a privilege for those kids who actually saw those changes. Remember, when these kids start going onto a new lifestyle modification, they feel less brain fog, they feel less fatigue, they feel less pain, they heal quicker from injury. So they themselves start experiencing the effects of a healthy lifestyle choice, and they start to manage their stress better, they start to manage the environment better. So you actually put them as a patient-centered principle to make them part of a functional protocol, and then having good sound boards just to measure some medical stuff off, like inflammation markers or an x-ray or ultrasound, where they can verify that their organ system is actually improving.
An interesting thing is also, you'll hear parents talk at birthday parties or at different events where they would argue that my child will play out all the sugar I gave them today, so I can give them any amount of sugary treats. They're just going to play it out. They're active. They're fine. How accurate is that?
So in some way it's correct, but you can burn the excess kilojoules, the sugar and the carbohydrates, but you can't get rid of the inflammation. So you can burn the kilojoules, you can't burn the inflammation. The inflammation's going to burn you.
Boom. There we go. Okay, next one. So Doc, What would be your advice when it comes to shopping? You know, mom busy grocery shopping, she's got a list. What do you look out for?
Still, the best is to know your ingredients, to know your list, and to check the list to see if there are any hidden dangers or inflammation drivers on there. So don't look at a label and buy a product, buy ingredients and go home and cook it yourself.
When it comes to weight loss, exercise plays a far more powerful role than most people realize. Movement doesn't just burn calories, it strengthens metabolism, protects muscle, improves mood, and supports long-term sustainable change. Yet many people feel overwhelmed, unsure where to start, or discouraged when workouts don't immediately reflect on the scale. It's not about perfection, it's about building a stronger, more capable version of yourself, one step at a time. So, exercise, obviously we know calorie in, calorie out is something we keep at the back of the mind, but is burning calories the only benefit of exercise, or is there another way physical activity benefits us in the weight loss industry?
Physical activity, obviously, if we look at exercise, I mean, you activate endorphins and serotonin and the neurotransmitter surge that's vital for the feel-good experience. That's why we generally feel good after a good workout. So from a medical point of view, you can also have a look at just upping your sex life a little bit and just put the spark back in the bedroom. So, I mean, you can really burn a good quality amount of kilojoules by just doing a proper workout in the bedroom, and I'm pretty sure the men's going yay. But if the women understand their hormone imbalances and profiles and they actually embrace the journey, not exercise alone, but not supplements alone, but not dieting alone, and not just drinking enough water alone is going to get to the final result. It's got to be sustainable. It's got to be with a long-term mindset. And once you start managing down the medical blood analysis, the lab tests, you start seeing results, seeing water retention coming down, seeing centimeters coming down, him making the mind shift and the change that, listen, bedroom play could be helpful in addition to exercise, just raw exercise as we know it, reactivating the muscle memory, rekindling the passion in the bedroom. So I think a combination coming back to a good balanced lifestyle that's sustainable long term.
Will the bedroom activities as well as exercise lower cortisol? Because we spoke so much about how cortisol is such a big drive behind hunger. Will something like exercise actually actively counter that?
So exercise actively lowers cortisol levels. It actively gets your muscles kicking up another gear, and you find another gear and you actually tweak the hormone ratios. The body loves to work in a specific biochemical ratio. And once you get each patient's individual biorhythm back and you biohack them back into their rhythm where they used to be, you reactivate their cell memory, you optimize their detoxification mechanisms. They don't have these cell debris and dead cells and lazy cells lying around that causes this autoimmune inflammation, immune dysregulation, then the biggest benefit for them is getting back the youthful body they had 10 or 15 years ago.